Welcome back. We are continuing our study in the book of James. Tonight we are in James chapter 4. We're in verses 11 through 17. In our past discussion, we were looking at this really pointed statement that James made towards those who are reading his letter, having to do with choosing sides between friendship with the world or friendship with God. And James really came to a major point of application in this book for deciding on if you're going to follow the wisdom from above versus the wisdom from below. In this next section, the section that we're going to look at now, we have some of the similar features that we saw earlier. But it's going to actually return to this bigger question of the tongue, this bigger topic, I should say, this theme of how does our speech define us? How does what we say, what we think, what comes out of our mouth, how does that impact what's going on in our hearts, and how does that demonstrate our character and who exactly we're following? And so we're really looking at two themes, two aspects associated with speech. One of those is associated with speaking in judgment against someone, really speaking in slander, as we'll see. And the other one is associated with presumption, that is presuming and planning on things without thinking about what God has intended. And so with that, let's go ahead and dive into our section of Scripture. Now, the first thing that we should point out is we've just closed off on a really high-level practical application of James working his way through and telling how people they need to be humbled, that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. He then gives these command after command, these imperatives, finally ending with the statement of that believers should humble themselves before the Lord, and He will exalt them. And then with that, we move into our passage. And as you can see, I've broken this down into two main ideas, speaking in judgment and speaking in presumption. Now, even as far as trying to outline this section, there's a lot of disagreement on how this section goes with the preceding passage that we've looked at, and how it should connect with the passages that we're going to look at in chapter 5. Some would even put a division between the section of speaking in judgment and the section on speaking in presumption. And I read different commentaries on this particular topic, but I do think that they are linked close together so in connection with the idea of speech. And therefore, it's something that we can at least take together. And we'll talk about some of these bigger ideas about how James is arranging his letter. So without further ado, let me go ahead and read through this section. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? And then the second section, speaking in presumption. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Now, as we've put these ideas together, I hope it actually really strikes you that one of the things we read in the second section is something that I think really impacts many Christian lives. And that would be the phrase, Lord willing. This is something that we find often in our lives, and something that I think is entirely biblical, something that we should consistently do. And that is to say, whenever we're going to do something, Lord willing, this will happen. We're making plans, Lord willing. Now, of course, doesn't mean we have to say it about everything, but it's an attitude of not boasting that we are actually in control of anything. And as we live through the days that we're living through now, with the virus raging and continuing to move up and down and through our country and through the world in general, this is certainly something that we need to pay close attention to. And it's something that actually we should get to be just a very straightforward truth, that we are really not in control. God is in control, and we are very temporal. And so if we look at these two together, we see that there is a lot of similarity between the two. One has to do with speaking in judgment, speaking in slander against someone, and how that's wrong, because we are ultimately not in authority. And then with speaking in presumption, or speaking and planning and acting like we're in control, that's also wrong, because we are not the ones in control of what tomorrow will bring. We aren't in control of our own lives. And so that's the main theme. And as you can see, it runs through what we talked about last week. It picks up on the idea that God will exalt us if we humble ourselves. And so these, you might say, are examples of how we are to humble ourselves in and through our speech. And so you can also see how speech and actions are closely tied together. Well, I just wanted to point out some aspects of judgment, because a passage like this can it might lead people to some wrong conclusions, and we're going to look at one in just a minute. But the first question you might add, or not the first question, but the first conclusion you might come to is that Christians are not called to judge. They're not called to judge, and this is something we have really with us all the time. The idea that we're to be non-judgmental, that we're not supposed to think critically about other people. We're supposed to be accepting. That we need to let people speak their truth, and so on in this postmodern world that we live in this very secularized society in which truth is largely the victim and largely outlawed from secular society. And I would say that that's not at all what James is talking about, and that's not at all what Jesus was talking about in a similar passage we'll look at in a second if we look at Matthew chapter 7. And to prove that, I'll go to Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 6, and this is Paul talking about how there were problems in the church and how different members were going to one another and actually bringing them before the courts, like the one you see here, and charging them with all kinds of lawsuits. And this is what he has to say to them. When one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare to go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? So right there, right off, our destiny as believers, as holy ones, is to judge the world. That is what we are called to. We can point to Revelation also in Revelation 2, where we read about the seven churches. We're told that we will have rods of iron, just as Psalm 2 talks about the Son of Man the Son of God having the rod of iron and sitting on the throne. We will have that role as judge and rulers of the world together with the Lord. That's our destiny. But that destiny it's not just in the future, it's what we are to do now. We are to judge within our churches. We are to think critically about them. And that's what it says in the next verse. And if the world is to be judged by you, are you inconsistent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels? So it's not just that we're judging one another. He goes even beyond and talks about having authority over the angels, over the angelic realm, which might be connected with passages like Psalm 8. He's made us a little lower than the Elohim, but that's a topic for another day. How much more then matters pertaining to this life? So if you have such cases, why do you lay them before those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is no one among you wise enough to settle a dispute between the brothers? And so we cannot be people who disregard our duty as believers, and particularly in the church. We have to settle disputes. We have to speak out when sin is being committed. We have to practice church discipline. And so when we read James saying, don't judge one another, that cannot be what the conclusion is, that we just simply do not pass any form of criticism upon other people, as is often misinterpreted in this passage. Well, and another thing that I think is important to connect this with is that James is really tied into Leviticus 19. We've talked about this in the past. Leviticus 19, when you hear the word Leviticus, your eyes probably immediately roll back in their sockets and you don't want to listen to it anymore. It's actually a very important book. It can be a very difficult book to read, but it's a very important book because it includes all manner of law associated with God's holiness and how Israel is supposed to relate to God. And I would say that it's a dominant theme in the book of James because James mostly deals with these moral issues, and he constantly returns to this idea that we need to follow the royal law, not be double-minded, and that royal law, as we'll see, is based in Jesus' statement that you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and might, and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, one of those is Deuteronomy 6, the Shema, but the other comes from Leviticus 19, and it happens, and we talked about it in the past, happens in verse 18, where it talks about you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But before that, we read something about slander. And so it's very interesting, if you read this section of Leviticus, much of the themes that we read about in James, about the poor being brought before the rich, about the tongue, slander, as we've talked about in the previous chapter, and of course just simply loving your neighbor as yourself, those all appear in Leviticus 19. And so it's kind of this backdrop by which he's using. And as we'll see in our next segment, it's not just Leviticus 19 he's reading it in the context of Jesus repurposing, or we should say owning and saying he's fulfilling the law, which Jesus also deals with this passage very much in the Sermon on the Mount. So just real briefly here, I'll read in the section here in the middle. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor, referring to a courtroom scene, but also referring against them, speaking evilly against them, speaking wrongly against them. And so that's really what the main issue is speaking evil against another person, another believer. And of course, it says there at the end, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Well, here's this section, and I wanted to point out one other aspect about this that is kind of intriguing. Scott McKnight has a commentary on the book of James, and he argues that James 3, to the passage that we're in right now, James 4 through 12, is all addressed to teachers. And I think there's some interesting, there's an interesting part to this suggestion. And one of the things he points out is that there is what's called an inclusio. Now, an inclusio is a rhetorical device that frames a section. And so in this case, it would start and talk about and address teachers and brothers being judged with a greater strictness. And then in verses 11 and 12, it would return to that theme about speaking evil, and then about how the lawgiver, the one who is the lawgiver and judge, he is the one who destroys. And so it kind of puts this whole message in a nice package for the reader. And so just as a reminder there in James 3:1, we read, not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. So if that's the case, if Scott McKnight is right, what that means then that everything that we've been talking about till now is specifically addressed to leaders and teachers in the church. But then, of course, it's still applicable to everyday believers, but the people who are being addressed would be teachers. I'm not sure I'm completely convinced of this, although it does have some things going for it. But in another sense, much of James, as we've been saying, is wisdom literature. So it's applicable to many different situations. And the thing that really comes to my mind is we can think of the opening chapters of Proverbs, which are addressed to my son. And even though it's like Solomon writing to his son, many of the virtues and the wisdom statements that are in those wonderful passages, Proverbs 4, 5, 6, and in that area, are applicable to anyone. And so the same thing can hold true here. Okay, so with that said, let's break this down piece by piece, because it's, I think, a kind of a really interesting section in James 4:11 through 12. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. That's the prohibition. You cannot speak evil. And as we've just said, that probably refers to slander, speaking against someone. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is only one lawgiver and judge who is able to save and to destroy. Who are you to judge your neighbor? And so this can be broken down into three parts. First is a prohibition. The next is an explanation for the prohibition. So the prohibition is don't speak evil against one another, brothers. The explanation has several parts to it. A statement about what speaking evil really means, and then clarifying what that statement means. Because he really makes this statement of a very deep problem for someone who speaks against the law. Because he says that they basically abhor the law, they stand in judgment over the law. And so it's really a progression. If you are acting as judge, speaking out and slandering, you're really not believing that the law is the law. You're standing in judgment over the law, and which means if you're in judgment over the law, that you have more authority than the law, when in reality, the law itself is the authority, and it comes from God himself. And so ultimately, you're saying that you have more authority than God when you do this. Now, in one sense, this can apply to all sin. This can apply to any disregarded command. But to James, who so values or so wants us to be warned of our speech and how that defines us, it's really significant when he talks about slander. But it also has the idea, if you are slandering, you are passing judgment on another person, not from the perspective of God, but from the perspective of yourself, which, again, puts you in the place of God, which is not your position. And then to tie this all back together, he ends with that concluding question, which I think is really important. Who are you to judge your neighbor? And we read the word neighbor, that connects us back to the things he said in the past, that you're to love your neighbor as yourself. And he even refers back to this as the royal law. And so this is actually going to give us some really information, some important information about who this lawgiver and judge actually is. Now, I thought it would be important for us to also think about an example of slander. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is a really nice model of the tabernacle. But I'd like us to think about what slander actually looks like. Here's one from the life of Moses with Aaron and his sister Miriam. It says that Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, has Yahweh indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And Yahweh heard it. Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all the people who were on the face of the earth. And suddenly Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. And the three of them came out. And Yahweh came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forward. And he said, hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, Yahweh I will make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of Yahweh. Why then were you not afraid to get to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of Yahweh was kindled against them, and he departed. Now, of course, in the narrative, Miriam gets leprosy, and it doesn't go well for her. And a few chapters later on down the line, both of them aren't going to make it. But the point is that Miriam and Aaron are speaking with jealousy, and they're looking at a part of Moses' character, and they're picking at it, and they're trying to use that as a way to slander him, despite all of the wonderful things that God has done through Moses and despite their relationship. And so this is, I think, a good example for what we are to avoid. that when we look at other people, we should think the best of them. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we're not critical, but I think we should also think of Jesus' words that we should be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. And sometimes we may have a thought about another person, but that thought should not immediately come out of our mouth. And we need to think, is this thought right? Is this thought marked by grace? Am I being humble? Am I being jealous? What are the elements here? And we should guard our own emotions and our own thoughts and our own feelings, because they may well be tinged with sin. Well, and again, we see the same thing here, and so much of this, as I've said, is connected with the Sermon on the Mount. I love this image showing the chapel there, and you can see these wonderful green hills that are loved by so many as they visit this area. And this is what Jesus says, very similar statement. Judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And so Jesus is saying that when you judge, you're going to be judged by that measure. And then he goes on to say, why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Now, I think the most important part of that passage for our day, besides the main point that Jesus is trying to get at, that we need to think about ourselves and have self-reflection before we say anything, is that the brother who sees the speck in his brother's eye actually goes and helps them get it out at the end of this. And so it's not that we are to just simply avoid criticism and avoid judgment and avoid speaking out against others. It's that seeing sin in other people, seeing problems with other people, should be a sign for us to immediately consider our own character and consider our own thought and our own intentions. And if it doesn't do that, we need to think and consider that we are simply out for others, and we're trying to make ourselves better and make ourselves be fulfilled by putting down others through slander and gossip. And so, again, very interesting to see these parallels here. Now, in this next section, I want us to focus also on who is the judge. Who is the judge here in this passage? Who is it being referring to? And of course, it's God. I mean, it's certainly God. But what might else be kind of in the background here if we think about the one who is standing as the lawgiver? Well, as we read, it says, there's only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? I like to think of this as a kind of as the famous Three Bears episode, with Goldilocks, right? At the end of that, after the porridge and the beds and the chairs, somebody's sitting in my chair. Maybe that's the middle one. I don't remember which. Somebody's sitting in my bed. Someone's sleeping in my bed. Someone's sitting in my chair. When we say that we are going to judge people for a particular sin, and we're going to not judge them righteously, we are claiming to have authority not given to us. It is not our place to be the lawgiver. It is not our place to be the judge. And I think that this is so freeing for us, that we don't have to have an answer to questions about other people's character, that God is the judge, that the Lord, the Savior, is the ultimate judge over people's sins and people's crimes, is that we don't have to ultimately answer for other people's souls and answer for other people's sins and crimes. And again, what I'm saying here is not that when you're in a specific situation where you're leaders of church or a parent, or if you are a business leader and there's issues with people in your organization, or even with you, with spouse. It's not to say you can't speak truth into people's lives, It's just this attitude of when you see issues, check yourself before you wreck yourself. No, but check yourself before you want to speak out against others. Now, what I want to kind of transition here is to focus on how this is setting it up to kind of be Moses. Because when we read that word lawgiver, that was actually a title given to Moses, which comes from this passage here in Malachi 4. Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. It's one of the last verses of the Old Testament. And it says, the law of my servant Moses. So does this mean that the Torah, the law, was Moses' law? Well, in some way it was, because he delivered it, but it came directly from the Lord. And so I think, of course, Moses is a very important figure, but the New Testament often is going to use Moses as a character to be supplanted by Jesus. And we see that in the book of Hebrews, in one of my favorite passages here in Hebrews 3. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant, to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. They're literally part of the family business. They are God, the Trinity together. They are God the Father, God the Son. And so as much as an important figure Moses is, of course he can't top what Christ has done. And so there's this kind of implied one-upsmanship in James 4:12 that I think he is getting at when he's saying this one lawgiver and judge. He's actually referring to Jesus. Now, of course, whenever we talk about this, we're not denying that God the Father is the ultimate lawgiver, but we have Jesus being defined as the lawgiver, I think, in James, but also as it flows from the Sermon on the Mount. So consider just a couple things about Jesus, and I love this image, the one lawgiver, the one judge on this wonderful statue that overlooks the area of the Mount of Beatitudes. In the Sermon on the Mount, I think Jesus is defined in all these terms. He is a new lawgiver. He's a judge. He's a savior. First of all, it starts with Jesus ascending to a mountain. It says, that's why we call it Sermon on the Mount. He goes up to the mountain and looks at the multitude, sets his disciples down, and begins to talk. Of course, he doesn't have to receive a word of knowledge from the Lord and then deliver it. He speaks himself, delivering the law, talking about specific aspects of the law, even dealing with, you have heard it said, I say to you. He bases all of these commandments, which he deals actually, as we've seen, with all of the moral commandments 6 through 10 in the Sermon on the Mount. And he bases the following of these laws on the heart, as opposed to what it had become, how it had been associated with tradition. He contrasts the Levitical law code, the law code of Exodus as well, the Ten Commandments, with what it had become with these traditional ways of getting around it. He also claimed that he would fulfill the law, that he has not come to turn anything, to do away with anything, but he will fulfill the law. And at the end of it, he actually positions himself as the judge and savior, right? He says, whoever listens to these words of mine, he will be like a wise man who built his house upon a rock. And if you're not, you're like one who built your house upon the sand, and that destruction is coming from him. We can look at all these passages, and I really recommend looking at Matthew 10:33 and 13:42, 25:41. These are just explicit passages that demonstrate that Jesus is the ultimate judge. He's been given authority to be the judge. And because James and in the Sermon on the Mount are so closely linked, and this theme of Jesus as lawgiver here, you just can't help but think that there is a strong connection between the two. And I would point to a couple other things as well. In James 1:25, towards the beginning of the book, after we read that James calls Jesus the glorious Lord, the Lord Jesus, he says, but the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. And he's referring to this royal law, loving your neighbor as yourself. And he, again, refers to that in James 2:8. He says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is the royal law of Jesus, and the royal law that James refers to. And so I would say that James, as well as Jesus, are depicting Jesus himself as this new lawgiver, savior, and judge of the world. And again, if that's true, and it is, just look at these passages, what does that say about Jesus? It says he is God, fully God and fully man. And so this is just another one of those functional arguments to just point out and say, look, Jesus has all authority given to him. You can't have all authority given to you and just be a dude. He's much more than human. Of course, he's not less than human. He is human and divine. And again, I love this one. And let me just read. This is Matthew 13. This is this famous Last Judgment of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of all his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. And so there again, you see it very clear that this is Jesus. He is at the center of all of this. And so I really think that that is who James is implying heavily is the lawgiver. Now again, I'm not trying to create a division between God the Father and God the Son, but it's trying to understand who does he have in mind when he's referring to this. And again, because the Sermon on the Mount is so much a crucial part of the story, it makes sense to make those connections. Well, moving into this next section, we'll spend a little bit less time on this. Speaking in presumption. And let me go ahead and read through this and make a few comments. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. Here we have the perceived reality of someone, and we have a return to something James really likes to do with the diatribe. Now again, a diatribe, we'll look at that in just a second, is not a straw man argument, but it's a way of assuming someone who is talking that can't actually say anything in the argument. And so you say that, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills. If the Lord wills. We say this all the time, Lord willing. One of my favorite expressions in Arabic is inshallah, which means if God wills. We have the same expression also to some extent in Hebrew, and we have it in many other languages, that if our plans work, it will be God's doing. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. And again, he's referring to the you, this actual reality. You're not in control in this diatribe. All such boasting is evil. This is a specific judgment about what he has just said. Then he gives this general wise teaching at the end. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. And so what I love in just kind of reading this together is that he is giving us a specific scenario. I should say it's that specific. It's general, but he's using an example of someone who goes off to probably on a business proposition, and he says why this is wrong. But then he adds another layer to it, and after calling someone out and saying that this is evil, he adds this sin of presumption on top of it. And so it's both presuming about what will happen and you being in control of your life and your time and deciding all these things that happen to you, but it's also about the presumption. If you actually do that, and most people should know that that's wrong, you're presuming on God in a double sense. You're presuming on him because you know that's wrong and you're still doing it. And so it's actually a really powerful rhetorical aspect of this, is that presuming that you're in power over everything and knowing that you're not, but still doing it anyway, is this kind of double presumption. And so again, that's this last section, 14 through 17. Now again, I'd like to just remind us, I don't want to spend too much on this, but this diatribe is really interesting because we often think of James and Peter as kind of country bumpkins who grew up in Galilee, where Paul is this elevated mix of Greco-Roman thought and rhetoric, as well as high-level Judaism. But James uses this here as well, this diatribe device. And I just like to read, this is from Euripides, who discusses and describes what a diatribe is. It is in the form of a question, becomes one of the characteristic features of the diatribe. It is evidently a development of the dialogue form, and it is traced all the way back to the Platonic dialogues. And so this is something that developed in the 5th and the 4th centuries BC with these great philosophers. And it presumes the presence of an opponent who's not permitted to reply. And so we see that same thing here. And it's just helpful to know these kind of devices to understand what James is setting up. We'll see it in this next section as well. Come now, you who say this. He's using a particular way of a particular type of rhetoric. Now, the specific type of rhetoric used here, or I should say the specific situation, probably refers to commerce. So when he says, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town to spend a year there and trade and make a profit, it's very vague, right? It could apply to a bunch of different situations, but the fact that he refers to profit and going to different places probably refers to the somewhat common practice of Jews living in the diaspora, setting up shop away from their family, away from their synagogue, and staying there to try and establish a business that they can then return home to, and through this trade and commerce have a much better livelihood. Now, James is not saying that there's anything wrong with doing that. He's not actually making a comment on that. The question is not should you make these big business ventures, but rather, how do you approach these? Do you approach these as a captain of industry who is a self-made man, who raises themselves up by their own bootstraps, who makes the calendar, and everyone else has to fall in line, and you get to decide all of these things? Or is God ultimately in control of your destiny and your fate? And again, as I alluded to earlier, if we aren't understanding this point in the days that we are living in, we are not paying attention. We're not letting the Holy Spirit use suffering and use the realities of our present circumstance with the virus and with rioting and with all of the things that we've been bombarded with. If we're not, if we're still trying to claim that we have some measure of control over our lives and over all of these aspects that are around us, and we're making claims that we will do this and we will do that, and we're missing the point that God's ultimately in control, and it is our job, it is our attitude to speak in our heart, but also let that come out of our mouth, that we acknowledge that He is the one in control. And that's much the same thing that we saw in the previous point, slander. That if we are slandering someone, we are standing in judgment over them, which means we're standing in judgment over the Torah, which means we're standing in judgment over the lawgiver himself. And so you might put it this way: if we're saying that we can determine what happens tomorrow for ourselves, we are in control of time, and therefore we are in control of the one who created time, which of course is not the case at all. Now, I love this next line, and I love this image here. We have him saying, what is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. What a fitting image. And here we have one of my favorite places to visit in Israel, Nimrod's fortress, or Nimrod's castle, at the foot of Mount Hermon, early in the morning with mist, and then later on after it has burned off from the same vantage point. What a fitting image for our life is that we arise in the morning, and by the end we're done. It's a symbol we see. It's an expression we see all throughout the Bible. We have Peter referring to it. That we are as the flower fades, right? We don't last. We're not around a long time, yet God remains throughout time. He is the one, as it says in Peter, Jesus is the same day. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I could also point to Job, who uses the same language. As the cloud fades and vanishes, so he who goes down to Sheol does not come up. In other words, someone who dies. So we come and go. We're fleeting. And so why we want to claim some level of control over what's happening around us, over our time, and not give over that control to the Lord is boastful, and it's showing pride, and it's showing that we are double-minded, that we are wanting to follow the power of darkness. Who wants that? He wants control. He wants to be in control of his time. He wants to be in control of casting judgment on others, and yet that's not our role. That's not our responsibility. And so that's, again, a reminder that all of this is wisdom from above versus wisdom from below. Who are we? Who are we following? Now, again, once more, we see this same theme in the Sermon on the Mount. And this one is a really obvious one. It's talking about how we are to consider time. And Jesus says the same thing. Now, I will say, in the case of James, it's negative, that we want to be in control of our time and how that's wrong, whereas Jesus is saying it in a positive way. Don't worry, because we're not in control. He's in control. Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. And of course, before that, he talks about the flowers clothe themselves, how God provides for birds, and how Solomon could not have been arrayed in such a splendor as these flowers of the field. But the same idea is the same, is that God is in control, and we can't control any of it. And so we shouldn't try to. That's not our job. That's not our responsibility. Now, in response to this, I love this example, and this will take just a minute to explain. Let me read the passage once more. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. So this is an example of best laid plans that end in ruin. This is another one of my favorite places to teach and visit in Israel. You're looking at a unfinished palace that was being built in the middle part of the 1960s that was abandoned in July 1967 at the outbreak of the Six-Day War. Now, in the Six-Day War, Israel fought against several Arab countries, including Syria and Egypt, which were the main issues. But it also fought against Jordan, who had control of much of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, and what today we call the West Bank. Now, King Hussein of Jordan had wanted to build for himself a palace near Jerusalem, not in Jerusalem itself, but near it, so that he could visit it more regularly and stay there. And so he began construction on this palace, which very ironically, and I always get tickled by this, is built on the same place that Saul, that is King Saul, the one who was with David, had his own home city and probably his own palace that he tried to kill David a couple times in his palace. And so, returning back to our kind of parable with King Hussein, as the war breaks out, Jordan is driven back across the Jordan, and the palace is never finished, and it remains again kind of this parable for those who have these plans to make and fulfill and to do, and yet do not consider all of the outcomes. Now, I don't want to speak to King Hussein's heart. Maybe he said, inshallah, that it will happen. But again, we see how things can change. Circumstances change. They turn on a dime. And despite our pride in our health, our wealth, and our well-being, and our understanding of the future, it's all in God's control. And so the path to prosperity, and I don't mean that in the physical or wealth sense, but in the prosperity of following the Lord in the right path of the righteous, is to give all that to Him. Give him control of the way we think about others. Give him control of the way we think about wealth and the way we think about our future. Because he ultimately is in control anyway, and he knows the way for us to live. Now, lastly here, I find these really, really fun and interesting. If we think about James, how he's putting these texts together, how he's writing a letter, what has he got in mind? Well, he's maybe got some problems he's trying to address, but he actually has, I would say, some texts that he has in front of him. One of those we've seen earlier, which I think is really interesting, Leviticus 19. Maybe he has either the memory of Jesus's teachings or perhaps a scroll. Maybe it's even the Gospel of Matthew, although I think maybe that's a whole other debate, but maybe a part of Jesus's teaching, or maybe, again, he's just remembering these things. But he also has Proverbs 3 in mind. Now, the reason why I say that is because as we read here in James 4:15 through 17, it says, "Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring, so whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." That kind of comes out of nowhere. That doesn't really fit with what he is saying. An ending with all such boasting is evil. Boasting about your boasting about your desire to go and do things, and not saying that God is in control of the situation. He could end with all such boasting is evil, but he adds, so whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Now, of course, that's a saying that's true. This is certainly true, and I think it's quite encouraging, but why does he say it? Well, it turns out that he seems to be working with Proverbs 3 in the Greek version of the Old Testament. And again, this is another one of those cool features, and here you have one of the earliest versions of the Greek Old Testament here on the left side of the screen with Codex Vaticanus. But what he's doing here is he's using the way that the Hebrew has been translated into Greek, and he's using the same wording. And so we can read it in Proverbs 3:27-28 in the Hebrew. It says, "Withhold not good for them to whom it is due, when it is in the power of your hand to do it." Now, actually, that reflects something we read a little bit earlier. "Say not unto your neighbor, go and come again, and tomorrow I will give, when you have it by you." Well, none of that really sounds exactly with what we've read in James 4. Now read it in the Greek. It contains the same idea, but it's the specific language that's really similar. And I'll read just the second part here. It says, "Come back another time. Tomorrow I will give, while you are able to do him good, for you know not what the next day will bring forth." And so this could be the reason why he is bringing this out here. That is the sin of presumption, or the sins of omission. Things that you know are wrong and you do them anyway. And so it's just really interesting to think here. That idea is running through Proverbs 3. He actually quotes this earlier in James. He quotes earlier in the chapter, in chapter 4, verse 6. He refers to this, and here we have it once more, referring to Proverbs 3. Well, lastly, in conclusion here, we see these warnings. James speaking in judgment. We have in the first part, warning against slander. This is rooted in Leviticus chapter 19. He talks about how a slanderer places themselves as a judge over another. How a slanderer disregards the teachings of the law, making themselves the judge of the law. He then points out that this cannot be the case, because there's only one lawgiver. You cannot sit in that chair. It is not your job. It is not your role. There's only one lawgiver, judge, and savior. It's not us. He then points back to Jesus' reworked Shema, where it connects Deuteronomy 6 with Leviticus 19. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and might. Love your neighbor as yourself. He roots that teaching then in this law. And then he's saying, as we've said, that this is the path that we have been called to, this path of righteousness, this path of holiness, which flows through allegiance to Jesus and his teaching and his law, which is not a new law in the sense that it's come out of nowhere and Jesus has made something completely new, but it is reformulated and repurposed, and now having him connected as both its original author with God the Father, but also through this direct allegiance to him as the king, as the one who has the royal law. And then we saw a similar idea in planning or speaking with presumption. He pointed out that our speech often conveys that we are in control of ourselves and our fortunes, but we aren't. He then says our speech should convey that we understand that God is in control of our life and destiny, but often case it doesn't. We are temporal, finite beings. We cannot boast. All such boasting is evil. He then ends with this general wise saying about these sins of presumption or sins of omission, which we've said is influenced by Proverbs 3, which occurs earlier in James. And so it's really interesting as we come to an end here. As we come to an end here, what's going on? There it is. It's really interesting as we come to an end here, how James puts these ideas together, and he uses these texts, Leviticus and Proverbs, as the backdrop of this text, as really the things he's teaching. You might even say preaching on. And so in this next section, we're going to turn our attention from James chapter 4 and then look at James chapter 5. And he moves forward in time to this time of reckoning. He's going to address the rich, those who are doing much of the things that we've just described, and he's going to address them and really condemn them for their pride. And so that'll be an important section to look at. We're getting close to the end. I think only a couple more sessions in the book of James in this